I'm Jill Allan. I'm the Exhibitions and Member Services Coordinator at the Alberta Craft Council at the Edmonton location. And I'd like to welcome Kari Woo, who is the curator of our current exhibition in the Discovery Gallery called The Democracy of Jewellery. And Kari's also a board member with the Alberta Craft Council and a great local artist and organizer in Alberta. She graduated from the Alberta University of the Arts. I guess at the time it was probably called Alberta College of Art and Design, as it was when I graduated. And Kari's been involved in lots of really interesting community projects, bringing artists together to organize sales opportunities and promotion opportunities. She's a great supporter of craft in Alberta and really committed to our community. And so it was very exciting to put together the Democracy of Jewellery exhibition with works selected by Kari and artists selected by Kari to participate. And today we're just going to talk a little bit about the exhibition so that folks that aren't able to come and see it in person have an opportunity to learn a bit more about the work and see what the exhibition looks like. I've taken some video, just some walkthroughs of the show, and we'll share that as well. But for now, I'd just like to welcome Kari and ask some questions about her ideas behind the Democracy of Jewellery. So welcome, Kari.
Thanks, Jill. I'm happy to be here and have the chance to chat with you about it.
Great. I guess one of the first questions I wanted to ask you about, and this is something that I've been thinking about a lot with the work that's in the show. I had some questions about the way that we consider value and materials of value and what makes something valuable. And so in the exhibition, there are 6 artists whose work is not jewelry in the traditional sense of using precious metals and gems as a way to adorn ourselves. And so I think that's really interesting. These artists are all using different materials than what we would ordinarily associate with fashion jewelry. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the way that we think about value. And I guess I'll just read you the question that I have as I've written it down. We rely on the value of precious materials and also resist it. How do the themes of the show relate to this idea?
I love this question. I could talk at length about it, but the concept for this show began when I was in a toy store with my son, and there was a DIY jewelry kit there. And so it was, if you remember Shrinky Dinks from what, maybe when you were a kid, but certainly when I was a kid, it was something that you could do, like a fun, really easy craft for kids. And it was very interesting because it was like a prefab jewelry kit, basically. So it got me thinking about how the access to materials like these and kits like these, how do they impact somebody like myself or my colleagues that have studied and are skilled, in the area of jewelry making, or, the goldsmiths who are traditionally trained and working with the precious materials. How does this impact, how does the access to those types of things impact our practices, or does it at all? And then I remember being on the trade show circuit as when I was making my living as a production jeweler, and there were people that I encountered along the way who were maybe not working at that level, like a Shrinky Dink kit, but they were assembling pieces, or they had prefabricated pieces that they were ordering from different supply chains and piecing them together, and that was their business. And so and there's a place for that in the marketplace, but then when they're my neighbor, and I'm in the same marketplace as them, and the person comes along and maybe comparing our work, it was kind of frustrating too, because to be side by side with work like that, when people are trying to figure out who to support and how to spend their dollars. So the question was fraught, I guess. And so the whole idea of this exhibition started with a question around, how does the preciousness of materials impact what we do, but how does the access to non-precious materials impact what we do as well? And as people will see when they see the exhibition, it's very interesting to witness what the folks who were selected to be part of the exhibition created out of materials that aren't generally considered valuable, but they've become very valuable at the hands of these makers. If that answers your question at all.
It's really interesting, the materials that the artist chose. Sarah Alford chose to work with hot glue, which is, something that we think of like this ubiquitous glue material, that you buy at Michael's and that people use for crafting and scrapbooking and those kinds, and instant fix kind of situations where you need to fix something quickly. And she's making beautiful adornments with that material that is so not precious. But what she does with it is so interesting and intricate, and I think time consuming. And, it changes the value of that material. And she has actually in her statement a really beautiful quote about the value of materials. And I'm just going to read that because I know we both found that so meaningful as makers, to hear her simple words about it. She doesn't elaborate. She just says it really simply. The material itself never fails to surprise me with its flexibility, responsiveness, and its glorious shininess. It taught me that affection and attention are transformative, that craft is the physical manifestation of a metaphor, one we create through our labor. Our work transforms a humble material into something that could not be on its own. A stone becomes a light, a thread keeps you warm, earth becomes a cup. Through this process, the material gives back, and thus we also become something that we could not have been without it. And I think what I took from that quote was that how by investing our time and love and energy and imagination into even a humble material, we can create something that's really rich and meaningful. And I don't know, when I read that, I just it just really touched me, that idea of transforming the value of something with your intentions and your sincere efforts and your time. And so that's again another idea about the value of something and how we perceive that. And I think that each of the artists is touching on that in their own way with the works that they're making.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think it's the meaning that we put into the material that becomes the value of these objects in the end, as opposed to just the intrinsic value of the materials themselves. And of course, being in the jewelry realm, everybody kind of relates to silver and gold and gemstones, but there was barely any of that used in any of these pieces. And just I think the process and the intent behind it, and for Sarah's pieces in particular, I mean, hot glue is not even it's like what holds other materials together. And so I love Sarah's work. It's always so witty and kind of cunning in a little bit, and so that she's exactly just taken this material, which most people probably would pay no attention to, and made it into something that is beautiful, but fleeting as well. I mean, there's a definite short lifespan to gun glue. It dries out and it cracks and it breaks and such, and so or it turns color eventually. And so I love how ethereal her work is that way. So the meaning of it is really, it's also bound by time, right? It's like it's meaningful now. And I mean, even as it moves on, but I love that. And for Devin Clark, she used in her piece Breadwinner, she used a collection of, bread ties that she's transformed into something very much a personal statement. That has, the pieces have taken on a really personal meaning to her, but for the viewer too, it's like everybody can relate with that, and now they've been turned into this other object, like they're taken out of context and you can see them differently. So I really appreciate that about her piece.
Yeah. The other interesting thing about that Breadwinner piece is, for me, I don't know where this comes from, but when I think of bread tags, I also think about time and calendars, because they have the dates stamped on them, like the best before dates. So it's also, there's that aspect to it too, which I think is really interesting.
Absolutely. And she shared with me that when she was making the piece and putting the bread tags together, she remembers some of them, where, and then she's just returned to Canada from living in the United States for 10 years. And so a number of them came with her from the States. And so because of course it's a pretty good collection of them. So it's like, a year's worth of bread that she's eaten, in those tags. So there's another time piece there. It's like the piece is kind of bound by time and memory there.
And even the title is quite good too, in terms, like if you think of it in terms of the idea of value and the themes of the show, I think it's
absolutely
a great title.
I loved it.
And I think with Jamie Kroger's work, she's also talking about the way that the value of an object changes depending on circumstances, like, and I think even sort of at time as well. She talks about the value of usefulness and safety and comfort over the preciousness of mainstream jewelry materials. And she's using colorful materials like enamel to really highlight sort of key portions of her objects. So where things make a connection, and she's used really bright enamel to color those areas. And her objects are really interesting, I think, too, because the materials are a little bit mysterious. Like when I first saw the photographs of her work, I thought it was ceramic, but it's not. It's metal with enamel on it. So they have been weathered, and they have this sort of used and distressed quality to them, as do Louise's materials. And so maybe we could talk a little bit about that shift in value that depends on circumstance and time and.
Well, I know for Jamie, her kind of lived experience that she draws from in a lot of her works were from her previous life as a park. She wasn't a park warden, but she worked for the national parks, and so she was outside a lot, and in circumstance, I believe maybe working on horseback, traveling by horseback, and so it's really always interesting to me to see how that translates into the narrative of her works. And these pieces in particular, I mean, they're quite big. And in her statement, she talks about the preciousness of safety, I think. And, if you think about that, I mean, isn't that more precious, than the materials that we might make something out of? And so the objects she made kind of are a homage, kind of, they're an ode to those kind of utilitarian objects, and that she chose to work with steel in particular, that, it does look weathered, it looks old, it looks battered, and then coat it with, enamel is basically a layer of glass on top of that material to highlight the preciousness of what these objects represent to her. I just love that. And she also used burnt coal in one of the pieces. One of the chains is made with wood that she burned down, and there are linkages that she clearly carved out of a piece of coal, like out of one piece, and the links are together. And so the time that took for her to do that, and I think maybe people that are looking at it can relate to that or understand that material a little bit better than they would like the welding of a steel link and the enameling, but just the time that it would take to do that, right? Carve those links out of that charcoal, but even just to burn that wood to that charcoal point, or I mean, unless it was a found material. Yeah, I really appreciated the way that those materials translated into kind of her personal narrative. And, you know, of course, being in the backcountry, fire is a big part of, you know, survival and, you know, feeling safe out in a space like when you're out in the wilderness, in the backcountry. And for Louise's pieces, you know, you use the word distress for Jamie's, which is interesting because hers are purposely made to look distressed, like the original objects probably were, where Louise is using the recycled denim from distressed jeans from, you know, the fashion industry. And so I love the double edge that she's walking, or it's like she's kind of talking about, you know, workers' rights and labor, because, you know, these high-end denim garments are being produced and then distressed on purpose because it's fashionable, you know, but this creates health hazards for the workers, you know, and the environment around the workers, you know, who are dealing with this labor, you know, which they're probably not being paid much for. You know, at the same time, denim at one point was or is a, you know, status symbol for the working class, or, you know, it kind of denoted a certain status in society. And so, you know, she's talking about that as well. And then just that she's used them in these beautiful compositions that mimic very precious jewelry, you know, like Chanel neck pieces or something. Like they're just gorgeous. And the way she's lined up the seams, the worn kind of edges, or actually the unworn edges or seams, you know, with the dark blue lines, or the faded lines, and paid attention to that, and the way the garments maybe were worn or constructed. It just adds so much meaning to a material that might have been discarded, or as meaningless, or, you know, is overproduced, and so it becomes meaningless. I mean, we were talking earlier about just how much waste the fashion industry adds to the landfills, and so, you know, that she's reclaiming this material, you know, that could be throwaway, you know, is a statement in itself. So there's a lot of depth to, you know, and intention in the choice of materials for that work. Absolutely.
Yeah. When I first saw the photographs of those objects, I thought that the denim was agate. The way that she's lined up the distress lines in the material, it almost looks like an agate, you know, the striations in stone or something like that. So very interesting. And I guess another question, I don't know, we didn't really talk about this earlier, but that idea of fashion and branding, how does that contrast or fit into your ideas about the Democracy of Jewellery show?
Well, I think sorry, if branding, and what was the other component to that question?
Fashion, like, you know,
Fashion, yeah.
there's a lot of talk, I notice these days, about branding, like more than I remember from when I was a student, but just, you know, in terms of preparing yourself and how you present yourself in your work as an artist, especially if you want to sell your work. There's all of this, you know, pressure to brand what you make and have a brand, stay true to your brand and stuff like that. And so I wonder if that's something that is a consideration in this show as well. Or I guess it came up for me with Louise's work, because a lot of the denim that she's using would have been like a designer brand.
Yeah. Well, an interesting tension that you're pointing out, because, you know, I feel like the impetus for myself in coming up with the concept for this show kind of was born out of that tension a little bit. And, you know, between kind of that marketplace driven that marketplace driven direction, I suppose, that a maker might choose to follow, because we need to make a living, when we exist inside a marketplace. But as an artist, as a creative person, at least for myself, and I know a number of my colleagues, I'm sure yourself included, you're always at odds with that, because it's not about the marketplace value all the time, right? And it's like, and I know for myself as a production jeweler, or even making custom jewelry, it's a very different mode of practice when you're kind of in that space, as opposed to, trying to express an idea. So, not that there isn't intention that goes into the other parts of my practice, but they're quite distinct, and they do inform each other. But I always found for myself this real tension in those different aspects of being a practicing artist, in a really market-driven economy, and if you're wanting to make your living as an artist, there's a lot of pressure to come up with things that people will buy. And so, does that change what you're making? Yes, I think it does. So I think this show is really interesting that way, because it's an exhibition, so that's not the intention behind the pieces that are presented here, which I love. And, there's a real place for, art jewelry. So, using jewelry as the medium to express an idea, and particularly around precious and market value. I think it's a really interesting choice of medium to express your idea, in terms of the format of it, right? So being relative to, what is a huge, multi-billion-dollar probably industry of costume and fine jewelry. Where does the independent maker fit into that, and then to contrast with that, like I was saying earlier, when I would be at trade shows and I'd meet other, they're independent makers, they're sole proprietors probably, or, but they're also, I found a distinct difference between people who were trying to come up with a good business idea and put all these pieces together and sell them for a good price, for a good profit. It was a very different way of operating a business than what I see, or how I was practicing myself as an artist, trying to find my place in a marketplace, meanwhile trying to stay true to, my modes of expression or my ideas. So there's a lot of tension in that intersection, I think, that you're talking about. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Tension is a good word for it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because you want your work to be recognizable, and you want to have an impact and a signature and a voice that's recognizable, but you don't want it to.
But the whole branding exercise, it can be kind of homogenizing too, right? So then, if you've branded and then all of a sudden you break out of your brand, then what? People. So then you're kind of playing to kind of consumer expectations, I guess. And so then, as an artist, it's a dilemma, and so I know for myself, I've separated I try to separate at times my business practices from my art practice. So, and that's not always easy to do, and a number of the artists that are included in this exhibition, the main part of their practice is about exhibition work and kind of staying true to their artistic visions and expressions. And so, so they may not necessarily make their livings as jewelers, which allows you a different kind of creative freedom. But then you've got to worry about, how you're going to pay the bill. So again, it's just like everything's just kind of fraught with a different kind of tension at a different point on the spectrum, I guess. So.
Well, I want to come back to talking about your work as well, but before we do that, I want to ask about Lindsay Rice's pieces. And her work is dealing with ideas of, about plumage and status and the military, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the themes in Lindsay's work and why you chose her to be a part of the show. And
I really love Lindsay's work because it talks about jewelry as a signifier, and she relates it a lot to the natural world, particularly birds. So you use the term plumage, but particularly birds, and the visual ways that there are, amazing visual ways that they signify to, their mates or to foes, their intentions, right? Whether it's to reproduce or stay away, or the whole alpha male thing, and the kind of dance that they go through in those situations. And so and it's always the male birds that have that really colorful plumage and kind of go through these displays. And then she kind of correlates it to military badges, and which I think is fascinating as well, and the different colors that are used to denote different kind of levels of, your accomplishment as a soldier or sergeant, or, those ranks, going through those ranks, right? And so there again is the status piece, and jewelry is often a signifier of status, right? So, and again, going back to Louise's work, is I love the contrast of her using this denim, like this ubiquitous, traditionally blue collar material to make these objects of status, right? And so similarly, Lindsay subverts her materials, or subverts the value of materials to create these statements of expression, and like they're very bright, and they're big, and they kind of do look like that they do look like they're from a wild exotic bird or something like that, right? And so and I think if you would wear one, your stature of your body would change, and I think your attitude could change. And so what I find really interesting is when I first see Lindsay's pieces, you don't even know that there's any metal in there at all, and so for a traditional jeweler, there some people might go, oh well, is that jewelry? It's like, well, yes, it is. It's art jewelry. But I love that it's the metal itself. The base material of these pieces is so camouflaged, which is the theme of her work, that you can't even tell that it's in there, kind of thing. So, and that's all intentional. That she's not using precious materials, right? That she's using color and texture and luster. I mean, there's a lot of different levels of luster in her pieces too. And so it's just so cunning is not necessarily the word, but there's a kind of a sharp wit in there for sure of I think the commentary she's making in there about status and the materials that we use to express that status, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So now I would like for you to talk a little bit about the themes and the works that you have in the exhibition.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe you could share with us a little bit about the stories behind those pieces. And one thing I also wanted to touch on with you, something that I noticed in your statement was when you were talking about how when you're preparing an artwork and you're making a piece that's personally significant and has meaning to you personally, what sort of strategies you use, or if you are using them, or if things just turn out that way. But with that really personal work, finding a way for it to still resonate with the public at large, or the audience at large, and a way for people to have access to the power of the work on their own terms, and to be able to read it and engage with it on their own terms. So I guess, on the one hand, the work is really personal, but on the other hand, it also has an appeal to a larger audience. But anyway, if you could just first talk a little bit about works that you have in the exhibition. That
Sure. So the three pieces that I have in the show, I've used, in these pieces, I've used the shrinky dink material. So I found a source for blank shrink-eating material. It's like people don't know what it is. It's a hilarious term. That's the market or product name of it. But it's basically like acrylic sheet of some sort that shrinks down in proportion in the oven. So I think it becomes like, I don't know, 30% or 20% of the original, you know, shape. So you can have these large drawings on this flat piece of, you know, acrylic paper that you draw in or whatnot, and then it shrinks down in the oven. I have a toaster oven in my studio. And so I just love that material. And I mean, that was where the impetus for the show came from, was that DIY shrink-eating kit. So I'm like, I have to use that material to make these pieces. But what I love about it is the transfer, how I can transfer images to that material, and then how those images transform when their scale transforms or changes. And so this is, I've been using images in my work for a number of years, and I've come up with all sorts of different ways to manipulate images. And this particular kind of direction of work started, I was still in art school, and I discovered a family photograph that nobody had really any information of. It was like of maybe some great-great-grandparents, and it really struck me that nobody in my family had memory of these people, you know, and we didn't have any stories, you know, because the migration of my family from China to Canada had happened. And so there was this real break in the family narrative and story, you know, and there was a lot of, in thinking about that, there was a lot of grief in that for me, you know, and then of course my family lost our, you know, mother tongue or language when we came over. And so a number of my especially my generation, but also my parents' generation even, don't speak the mother tongue. And so, you know, what is lost in translation there? And so my only link to, you know, thinking about the, you know, these stories that were lost were these photographs. And so I started to use these photographs in my work. And that was what the link was to other people's stories, which was really interesting. And, you know, when I first started this work, it wasn't about showing. I mean, it was very personal. It was kind of a way for me to, I guess, process understanding my family's migration story and dealing with issues of, you know, identity and racism and assimilation and acculturation, and, you know, and also cultural appropriation, which I actually employ myself to make these pieces sometimes. And so what I found was people really related to those photographs and those images. And so that was kind of the bridge. And you know, often I'd have like some kind of family artifact, like maybe an old piece of jewelry or some meaningful material that had a lot of sentiment for me, but also when other people saw something like that, they could put their own meaning to that material, you know, whether it was a pearl, or I know in one piece I used an image of my auntie's silk scarf kind of thing. And so it was the images that really allowed me to understand how universal the, you know, what I was trying to express in these pieces was about. So because people would approach me when they saw these pieces and want to talk to me about the works. And of course they were interested in the works, but what I realized was that these works were just kind of a catalyst for the folks I was talking to share their stories, which was really amazing. And so I realized how much I had in common. I mean, these deeply personal, you know, and traumatic, you know, things that I was trying to, you know, process in my own way, in kind of my private creative process way. What we're speaking to people because they had similar things that they were trying to process. And so I thought that was quite fascinating. And so, I mean, it continues to happen. And I'm always, these works are always driven by the image that I'm using. And so the pieces in the show took a little bit of a departure. There is one piece in there that uses images from my family, but then the other images for the more recent two pieces, one was I took images out of a roadmap book that's of Calgary, which is where I grew up. And so I chose different spots in Calgary where I had kind of like significant transformative, you know, experiences or, you know, milestone or rites of passage type of experiences. And I put a little rivet in the spot, you know, kind of basically, you know, where the house was that I grew up in. And, you know, when you're on the trail and there's like, if you cross country ski, you know, there's always a screw in the metal map that says you are here. So that's kind of what the rivet was kind of like. So, you know, I don't know if people would pick up on that detail necessarily if they weren't told that, but I think everybody can relate to maps. And so, you know, and the title of that one is Route Map, but route is spelled R-O-O-T. So it continues along that line of thinking about what creates a person, and what's the impact that those experiences have on our responses, and the way we carry ourselves into the world. And so that's where that piece came from. Yeah. And the other piece that's more anatomical was kind of a reflection. I had some health issues in the last few years, and so it was kind of thinking more about like actual physical body function, but it's still related to all those other pieces, because it's like there's the idea of like, well, how do we store things in our body? If they're traumatic or joyous experiences, how are those kind of stored in our bodies? And so I was thinking a lot about that in making that piece. And so that one's called Inside Out. So the series of works that are in this exhibition are a series of self-portraits, and together the three of them seem a little bit disparate, but my thinking was connected on all of them.
For sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they're definitely connected.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Do we have any other questions we want to cover?
No, not necessarily. I mean, I guess I would just add to my bit that, the using that material again was, I mean, there's a part of it that's really practical in that it was a really great way to be able to transfer images, or, use the images, but also it's very intentional that the material, is not a expensive or, traditional jewelry material, I guess. So, but other questions? Well, I guess a comment for me would be, I was in some ways surprised what people submitted, because I didn't pick particular pieces. I asked people to participate in this exhibition because I kind of had an idea of their approach to their practices, and knew that most of the folks that were involved used alternative materials. But it was just really interesting to me because everybody stayed true to their kind of artistic trajectory, but were also able to fit into the theme of this exhibition. So it's not like some people did make pieces particularly for this exhibition, but they're not outside of the scope of their regular artistic practice. So I just thought that was really fascinating, because I didn't know that was necessarily going to happen. And even for myself, I mean, I was trying to bend my ideas to fit what I thought the idea was. And then I couldn't, it wasn't flowing creatively. And so then when I just kind of let go of that and stayed within, what was inspiring me, then it came out the way it did. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think it's a really beautiful, interesting show. And I hope that lots of people will have the opportunity to come and see it. It's on October the 2nd, which is a Saturday. I guess it's this Saturday. So yeah, we've had lots of great feedback from people coming in to look at the show so far. And so hopefully more people will get to see it.
Well, I'm looking forward to it coming to Calgary as well, and mounting it here as well.
Yeah, and so that's a good point. The show will travel to the Calgary gallery space in C Space King Edward. And we're hoping to have an event during the run of the show at C Space where we have a panel discussion with the artists from the show. And hopefully that will be an in-person event. Otherwise, it'll be an online event, a virtual event. So we'll be sure to let everyone know when that's happening as well. Anyway, I really appreciate you coming, making time to talk to me today, and your willingness for us to put this online. And so thank you very much.
Well, thank you too. I really appreciate that there's a space to do things like this. So I've always appreciated and advocated for the work that the Alberta Craft Council does. And I also want to say thank you to all the artists that participated and the effort and time that they've put into submitting works for this show. It's a very interesting cross-section of works. And I also think that it highlights just a different aspect of craft practice in Alberta that people might not be alert to. So I do hope more people see this show. Yeah, and thank you for all the thoughtful questions. I really appreciated this conversation.
Me too. It was a great conversation.
All right. Thanks, Jill.
All right. Thanks, Kari.